summer heat pressed down like a heavy blanket over the small Alabama highway. Cars passed by in the distance, their engines humming faintly through the thick, golden air. On the side of the road, Richard Hayes, a man in his late 70s, sat alone in a sleek black Lexus. He wore an expensive linen shirt that now clung uncomfortably to his back. The air conditioner hummed weakly, doing little to fight the sweltering afternoon sun. Richard wasn't used to waiting. He wasn't used to being stranded. In fact, he wasn't used to being helpless about anything. He had built his fortune from scratch decades ago. Real estate, finance, investments. He'd spent a lifetime learning how to control outcomes, how to make things go his way. But on this lonely stretch of highway outside Brookhaven, all that control meant nothing against a stubborn flat tire and a dead cell signal. He tapped the steering wheel impatiently, glancing again at the phone screen. No bars, not even one. He muttered under his breath and leaned back, trying to remind himself to stay calm. Minutes stretched. The sun sank lower, baking the asphalt until the air shimmered. That's when Richard noticed movement in his side mirror, a faint figure walking along the roadside. He squinted, raising a hand to block the glare. It was a boy, maybe 13, maybe 14, skin glistening with sweat, carrying a worn backpack slung over one shoulder. His sneakers were scuffed, one lace dragging in the dust. Yet there was something determined in his stride. Something steady. The boy slowed as he approached the car, his curious eyes scanning the shiny Lexus before meeting Richard's tired gaze. "Got a flat, sir?" the boy asked, his tone calm but confident. Richard let out a half-laugh, half-sigh of relief. "Yes, it seems that way. I've been stuck here a while," he replied, his voice cracking with frustration and fatigue. The boy nodded once. "I can fix it for you," he said simply, setting down his backpack. "My dad taught me how to change a tire last year. Do you have a spare?" Richard hesitated. He wasn't used to strangers offering help, especially not children. Still, something in the boy's tone carried a quiet assurance that disarmed him. He gestured toward the trunk. "It's in there." Without another word, the boy popped it open, pulling out the tools and the spare tire. His movements were efficient, practiced. Richard watched as the boy loosened the bolts, lifted the car, and swapped the tire like he'd done it 100 times before. The older man stood there, sweat beading on his forehead, feeling oddly useless. For a moment he wanted to reach out to help, but he didn't know where to start. When the job was done, the boy straightened up, wiped his hands on his jeans, and gave a small smile. "All good now," he said. "You're ready to go." Richard pulled out his wallet, fingers trembling slightly. He wasn't the kind of man to forget a favor. "Here," he said, holding out a few crisp bills. "I insist. You just saved me a lot of trouble." But the boy shook his head, a hint of amusement flickering across his face. "No, thank you, sir," he replied. "I didn't do it for money." Richard blinked, caught off guard. He was used to transactions, not generosity. People did things for a reason always. "Are you sure?" he pressed. "At least take something for your time." The boy's expression softened. "I'm just glad I could help," he said. Then, with that same steady stride, he picked up his backpack and started walking down the road again. Richard stood there in silence, the bills still in his hand. He watched until the boy's figure grew smaller and smaller, fading into the orange horizon. He slipped the money back into his wallet and sat quietly in his car. But something about the encounter lingered in his chest, an ache he couldn't name. For the rest of the drive home, the image of that boy haunted him. The dusty sneakers, the polite smile, the refusal of money. It all felt so foreign, so pure. By the time he pulled into the long driveway of his sprawling estate, night had begun to fall. The mansion stood tall and still, its lights glowing through perfect glass windows. Inside, everything was exactly as he left it, quiet, polished, expensive. But somehow it all felt emptier than usual. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. A wealthy man surrounded by luxury, yet utterly alone. He thought about the boy's words again. "I didn't do it for money." It struck him harder now, echoing through the quiet of his thoughts. He realized that somewhere along the way, he had forgotten what kindness without motive even looked like. That night, Richard barely slept. He tried to distract himself, reading, pouring himself a drink, flipping through the channels, but nothing worked. Every few minutes, his mind drifted back to that boy on the roadside. He replayed the moment over and over. The way the boy had smiled so easily, The calm in his voice, the quiet confidence in his hands as he worked. There was something unshakable about that memory. When dawn broke, light spilled through the tall windows of his study. Richard sat in the same leather chair he'd owned for 30 years, surrounded by shelves of books he hadn't opened in decades. His untouched breakfast sat beside him, the eggs gone cold. For a long time he just stared at the window, lost in thought. Why did that boy's kindness feel so heavy in his chest? Why couldn't he let it go? By mid-morning he had made up his mind. He was going to find the boy. He didn't know what he would say when he did. Maybe he just wanted to thank him properly. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was something deeper, an ache that money and success could never quiet. He started his car and drove back to the same stretch of highway where the flat tire had stopped him. The road looked different in the light. Calm, peaceful. Birds cut across the sky, their wings flashing white in the sun. But the boy was nowhere in sight. Richard parked on the shoulder and asked around at a nearby gas station. The cashier, an older man with a thick accent and kind eyes, shook his head. Lots of kids walk along that road, mister. Can't say I remember one in particular. Richard thanked him and drove on. He stopped at a diner, then a grocery store, then a hardware shop, repeating the same question to anyone who would listen. Finally, at a small roadside cafe with a hand-painted sign that read, Millie's Kitchen, he found a clue. The woman behind the counter, a cheerful lady with graying hair tied in a bun, tilted her head when he described the boy. Sounds like you're talking about Caleb, she said with a smile. Good kid. Always fixin' things for folks around here. Lives out past Mason Creek with his mama. Don't got much, but they make do. Caleb. The name felt right. Simple. Honest. Thank you, Richard said, scribbling down the directions she gave him. The drive to Mason Creek took nearly an hour. The landscape changed as he went, open fields giving way to dense woods, then to a cluster of small houses that looked like they'd seen better days. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp earth. When he finally spotted the house she had described, he slowed to a stop. It was small, worn, but neat. The paint was peeling, and the porch leaned slightly, but there were flowers growing in mismatched pots by the steps. Something about it felt alive. Richard sat there for a moment, unsure if he should get out. What was he doing here? Would they think he was some old man with too much time on his hands? Or worse, pity in his heart? But before he could overthink it, he stepped out and knocked on the door. After a moment, it opened. A woman stood there, 40, maybe early 40s, with kind eyes that mirrored the boy's. Her hands were still damp from dishwater, and her face carried the quiet exhaustion of someone who worked too hard for too little. Good morning, Richard said awkwardly. I'm sorry to bother you. I believe I met your son yesterday, Caleb. He helped me change a flat tire. Her expression softened instantly. That sounds like my boy, she said with a small, proud smile. He's always helping someone. Never could walk past a person in need. I just wanted to thank him, Richard said. He wouldn't take any money from me. I thought maybe I could repay him somehow. The woman shook her head gently. You don't need to repay him, sir. That's not why he helps people. But you're welcome to come in and say hello if you'd like. Richard hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Thank you. The inside of the house was small but warm. The furniture was old but cared for, the walls decorated with family photos and hand-drawn pictures taped up near the doorway. He saw one photo of a younger Caleb holding a fishing rod beside a small river, his grin wide and fearless. Out back, the woman said, pointing toward the window. Richard followed her gaze and saw Caleb kneeling by a broken fence, hammer in hand, tapping a new board into place. As Richard stepped outside, the boy looked up, his eyes lighting up with surprise. Hey, you're the man from the road, he said with a grin. Glad to see the car's still running. Richard smiled back. It's running perfectly, thanks to you. He paused, unsure how to begin. I came by to thank you properly. You helped me when you didn't have to, and I can't tell you how much that meant. Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans. The same jeans from yesterday, now dusted with sawdust. It wasn't a big deal, sir. You just needed a hand. But to Richard it was a big deal. Maybe the biggest one in years. The simplicity of Caleb's answer left him speechless for a moment. He glanced around the yard, the uneven grass, the patched-up fence, the porch sagging slightly under its weight. Then he looked back at Caleb. You've got a good heart, son, he said softly. Your mother must be proud. Caleb smiled, glancing toward the house. She is. She works real hard, so I try to help out where I can. Something stirred in Richard's chest, an old memory of his own youth, long before the suits and boardrooms and stock reports. He remembered fixing fences with his father, learning how to patch roofs and split firewood. He remembered the smell of sweat and sawdust and the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. Standing there, in that quiet backyard, he felt it again. A piece of himself he hadn't touched in decades. I'd like to do something for you, Richard said at last. You and your mother. Caleb frowned slightly, cautious. You don't have to, sir. We're okay. Richard shook his head. It's not about need. It's about what's right. You helped me, and I want to return that kindness. Before Caleb could answer, the screen door creaked open. His mother called out, Caleb! Wash up before lunch. Then she looked at Richard, her expression soft but curious. You're welcome to join us if you'd like. It's just soup and bread, but there's plenty. For a moment, Richard stood frozen. He couldn't remember the last time anyone had invited him into their home like that. Not for business, not for obligation, but out of pure sincerity. He nodded slowly. I'd be honored. As he stepped inside, the scent of fresh bread and herbs filled the air. The small kitchen glowed in the midday light, and the sound of Caleb humming quietly as he washed his hands at the sink made the space feel alive. Richard sat down at the table, realizing that for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about his next meeting or his next deal. He was just there, and somehow that felt like enough. Lunch was simple, but it felt like a feast. The soup was thick with vegetables from the backyard garden. The bread was warm, soft in the middle, with a crust that crackled as they tore it apart. Richard couldn't remember the last time he had eaten food that tasted like this. Not because of the flavor, but because of what it meant. It was made with care, not convenience, served with kindness, not obligation. Caleb talked as he ate, telling stories about school, about how he fixed old bikes for his friends, and how he wanted to build things when he grew up. Not just houses, he said with a grin. Maybe bridges, maybe schools, big things that make people's lives better. Richard found himself smiling without even realizing it. He watched the boy's eyes shine with ambition and saw something he hadn't seen in himself for a long time. Hope. Caleb's mother spoke quietly between bites, asking polite questions about where Richard lived and what he did. When he mentioned real estate and investments, she nodded respectfully, though she didn't seem impressed by the wealth behind his words. There was no envy in her eyes, only curiosity. You must have worked hard for what you have, she said. I did, he answered, his voice slower now. But somewhere along the way I stopped working for anything that mattered. She tilted her head, studying him with quiet understanding. Sometimes, she said, people forget the value of what they already have. Her words landed heavier than she knew. For the rest of the meal, Richard couldn't stop thinking about them. When they finished, Caleb stacked the bowls, humming softly as he cleared the table. The boy moved with the same quiet determination he'd shown on the roadside. It struck Richard again, how someone so young could carry so much dignity. He glanced around the kitchen. The wallpaper was faded. The linoleum floor had worn patches. The chairs didn't match. Yet there was life here, real life. Laughter, conversation, the sound of a family that looked out for each other. It made his mansion feel colder than ever. As Caleb's mother set a fresh pitcher of water on the table, Richard turned to her. You've raised an extraordinary boy, he said. Her smile was gentle but proud. He's a good kid, she replied. We've had our hard times, but we've learned to make the best of what we've got. Life's not about what's missing. It's about what's left, Richard nodded slowly. Those words settled deep inside him. He wanted to argue, to say that success came from striving for more, but he couldn't, because she was right. After lunch, he stepped outside with Caleb, who was still holding his hammer from earlier. The air was warm and smelled faintly of pine sap and dust. You really fixed that fence by yourself? Richard asked. Caleb grinned. Mostly. It's old, so I just keep patching it. We'll get new wood one day. Richard looked at the mismatched boards and crooked nails. It's not perfect, he said softly. But it's strong. That's what matters, Caleb nodded, proud. That's what my dad used to say before he passed. He said you don't give up on something just because it's broken. You fix it. The words hit Richard like a wave. He felt his throat tighten, and for a moment he had to look away. That was it, the reason he couldn't stop thinking about the boy. Because Caleb was living a truth that Richard had forgotten, that people, like fences, could be mended if someone cared enough to try. He turned back to the boy. "Caleb," he said quietly, "I'd like to help you and your mother. You've given me something I didn't know I'd lost." Caleb frowned, unsure what to say. "You don't have to—" "I know," Richard interrupted gently, "but I want to. You helped me when no one else did. Let me return the favor." Before Caleb could argue again, his mother called out from the porch holding 2 glasses of lemonade. "Come on, you two. It's too hot out there to be working." They sat together in the shade, sipping the cool tart drink. The sound of cicadas filled the air. For a while no one spoke. The quiet wasn't awkward, it was peaceful. Finally, Caleb's mother looked at Richard. "You seem like a man who's used to giving orders," she said with a faint smile. "But today you don't have to do anything. Just sit and breathe." He chuckled softly. "That might be harder than you think." Caleb laughed too, and the sound was so pure that it almost startled Richard. It had been years since laughter had sounded like that to him. Free, uncalculated, real. When it was time for him to leave, Caleb walked him to his car. "Thanks for coming by, sir," the boy said sincerely. "I didn't expect to see you again." "I didn't expect to come back," Richard admitted. "But I'm glad I did." As he drove away, he kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Caleb was still standing in the driveway waving, the sunlight spilling around him. Richard's chest ached. Not with sadness, but with something new. Something alive. That night he couldn't sleep again. But this time it wasn't restlessness, it was purpose. He sat at his desk, the moonlight catching the edges of his old photographs. His wife gone now for many years. His business partners long retired or buried. His children grown and distant. For the first time he realized how much of his life he'd spent surrounded by people, yet disconnected from all of them. He picked up the phone. His voice was quiet but sure. "George," he said when his old contractor answered. "I need a crew. There's a project I want to start immediately. Something important." The man on the other end chuckled sleepily. "You never change, Rich. What kind of project are we talking about?" Richard smiled faintly. "The kind that fixes what's really broken," he said. And with that, the plan began to form. Something that would change not only Caleb's life, but his own. By sunrise the next day, Richard was already on the phone again. He called in favors he hadn't asked for in years. Old partners, builders, suppliers, people who still owed him their respect even after retirement. His voice carried a conviction they hadn't heard from him in a long time. Within days, trucks began rolling into Mason Creek, vans filled with lumber, tools, paint, and workers pulled up along the narrow dirt road that led to Caleb's house. The sound of hammers, saws, and laughter filled the quiet air of the small neighborhood. Caleb and his mother stood on the porch, stunned. Neither of them had been told this was happening. Richard stepped out of his car, clipboard in hand, his shirt sleeves rolled up. He looked younger somehow, lighter. "What is all this?" Caleb's mother asked, her voice trembling. Richard smiled, gentle but firm. "A thank you. You gave me something I didn't realize I'd lost. Let me give something back." She shook her head, still in disbelief. "You don't have to do this, Mr. Hayes. We've managed fine." Richard's eyes softened. "You've done more than manage. You've built something worth admiring. But sometimes good people deserve a little help too." Caleb was quiet, his hands shoved into his pockets as he watched the workers unload supplies. "Sir, this is a lot," he said carefully. Richard knelt slightly to meet his gaze. "You once told me you liked building things that make people's lives better." "Well, this time I'm building something with you." The boy's eyebrows lifted in surprise. "With me?" Richard nodded. "If you're willing to learn. You've got steady hands and a sharp mind. It's time you saw what those can do." The days that followed were filled with motion. The sagging porch came down first. New beams went up, strong and level. The old shingles were stripped away and replaced with fresh wood that glowed honey gold in the morning sun. Caleb was there for every step. At first he only watched. Then he asked questions about measurements, about leveling, about why certain tools worked better than others. Before long, one of the crewmen, a broad-shouldered man named Joe, handed him a measuring tape and said, "Go on, kid. Let's see what you've got." From that moment, Caleb was everywhere, carrying planks, steadying ladders, double-checking angles. His energy was contagious. Even the workers who'd seen every kind of job found themselves smiling as they worked beside him. Richard spent most of his time pacing the site, not as a boss, but as a man rediscovering purpose. Every nail that sank into wood, every brushstroke on the fresh white walls, filled a space inside him that had been empty for years. At night, when the crew packed up and drove off, Richard stayed behind. He'd sit on the porch steps beside Caleb, both of them watching the fireflies dance in the warm dusk. "You know," Richard said one evening, "when I was your age, I thought success meant never needing anyone. I thought it meant being the man who gives orders, not the one who listens." Caleb tilted his head, curious. "And now?" "Now," Richard said, gazing out at the fading light, "I think I had it backward. Real strength comes from what you give, not what you own." Caleb nodded thoughtfully. "My mom says that too. She says when you give with a good heart, you never really lose anything." Richard smiled. "She's a wise woman." The following week, the project neared completion. The new porch gleamed in the sunlight. The fence stood firm, and a fresh coat of paint turned the small house into something bright and full of life. The old swing set out back, once broken and rusted, was replaced with a sturdy one that creaked softly in the breeze. Caleb ran his hands over the polished wood, eyes wide. "I can't believe this is ours," he whispered. Richard stood a few steps behind him. "It was always yours. I just helped uncover what was hidden." That evening, the small town gathered outside the newly finished house. Neighbors brought homemade bread, pies, jars of jam, and flowers from their gardens. Children ran through the yard, their laughter mixing with the hum of cicadas. Caleb's mother walked up to Richard, holding a glass of iced tea. Her eyes shimmered with tears. "You didn't just fix a house," she said softly. "You gave us a reason to believe again." He took the glass, his throat tightening. "You gave me that reason first." They stood together for a long moment, watching Caleb play with his friends, his laughter cutting through the warm night air like a song. When the crowd thinned and the moon rose high, Richard lingered on the porch. He felt no rush to leave. For once, he wasn't thinking about profit margins or deadlines. He was thinking about what it meant to feel alive again. Caleb joined him, breathing hard from running. "It looks amazing, doesn't it?" "It does," Richard said, smiling. "But you know what looks even better? Seeing you this happy." Caleb kicked at the porch step lightly, grinning. "I've been thinking, sir. When I grow up, I want to build homes too. Not just for me. For people who need them." Richard felt something swell in his chest, a pride he hadn't felt even at the height of his career. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Then you already know the secret to success. You start by caring." Caleb looked up, eyes bright. "You think I can really do it?" "I know you can," Richard said firmly. "You've already built something most people spend their whole lives searching for. Heart." The boy smiled, wide and fearless, the same way he had the day they met on the highway. Richard turned to look out over the yard, the lights flickering softly in the windows, the scent of new wood and baked bread in the air. He realized something then, something deep and simple. He hadn't come here to save anyone. He had come here to remember how to live. In the weeks that followed, the house became more than just a home. It became a gathering place. Neighbors who had once passed by without stopping now came to share coffee on the porch. Kids rode their bikes down the dusty lane just to see the new swing set Caleb couldn't stop talking about. Laughter filled the air every evening, spilling from the windows into the quiet of the surrounding woods. Richard kept visiting, though he stopped thinking of it as visiting. The long drives no longer felt like chores. Each time he turned down the familiar dirt road, he felt something settle inside him, as if he were coming back to a place that had always been waiting for him. Caleb would meet him halfway down the path, waving, his face bright with excitement. Some days they talked about school. Some days they fixed small things around the house together. Other days they didn't talk much at all. They just worked side by side, the silence easy and full of understanding. One afternoon, as they painted the final section of the backyard fence, Caleb paused and asked quietly, "Why did you really help us, Mr. Hayes?" Not the short answer, the real one. Richard leaned on his paintbrush, looking out at the horizon. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the trees. "Because you reminded me of someone I used to be," he said. "A man who cared about more than numbers and profits. Somewhere along the line, I lost him. You helped me find him again." Caleb thought about that, his brow furrowed. I didn't do anything special. Richard shook his head slowly. You did everything special. You did something the world doesn't do enough anymore. You helped without asking why. They finished painting in silence. When they stepped back to look at their work, the fence gleamed under the sunset, the boards perfectly aligned. That night, Richard stayed for dinner again. The house smelled of roasted chicken and herbs. Caleb's mother talked about her plans to take evening classes at the community college, something she had always wanted to do but never thought possible. Caleb talked about school projects and how he had started teaching his friends basic carpentry. As they ate, Richard listened, soaking in every word. The laughter, the small talk, the easy warmth of the room, it all filled the hollow places in him that had been empty for too long. After dinner, they sat out on the porch, the air cool and heavy with the scent of rain in the distance. Lightning flickered far off on the horizon, and thunder rolled softly through the hills. Caleb leaned forward on the steps, his elbows on his knees. Mr. Hayes, he said, I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about helping people. I want to do more of it, not just when I see someone stuck on the road. I want to make a difference. Richard smiled, watching him. Then you will. You already know how to start, with heart. Caleb turned to him, eyes serious. When I grow up, I want to build homes for people who can't afford them. Like real homes, not just walls and roofs, but places that make people feel safe. For a moment, Richard couldn't speak. His throat tightened and he felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Pride, gratitude, something deeper than both. You know, he said softly, you've already built one. You built it right here for me. Caleb blinked, confused. What do you mean? This place, Richard said, gesturing to the house, the porch, the laughter drifting from inside. You gave me back something I didn't even know I was missing. You built that. The idea. Boy smiled shyly, and for a long while they sat in silence, listening to the rain begin to fall. When it was time for Richard to leave, Caleb and his mother walked him to the car. The porch light glowed behind them, warm and soft against the dark. Thank you, she said, her voice trembling slightly. For everything. Richard shook his head. No, thank you. You showed me what it means to have a home. Caleb grinned. You're coming back next week, right? We've still got that tree house to finish. Richard chuckled. I wouldn't miss it for the world. He started the car but didn't drive off immediately. He looked at them one last time, the boy with the boundless energy, the mother with the steady strength, and felt a quiet peace settle over him. The kind that comes only when a man finally understands what his life has been leading to all along. As he drove down the winding road, the rain tapping gently on the windshield, he thought about how strange fate could be. One flat tire, one small act of kindness, and everything had changed. Weeks turned into months. Richard kept visiting Mason Creek. He helped Caleb build that treehouse, helped his mother enroll in her classes, and eventually started a small fund to renovate more homes in the area. He called it the Creekside Project, but everyone in town called it something else. Caleb's Gift. People began to volunteer. Families who had once struggled helped other families repair their roofs, repaint their walls, rebuild their lives. And every time someone asked Richard why he did it, he always gave the same answer. Because one, boy reminded me that real wealth isn't measured in what you own, it's measured in what you give. Years later, when Caleb graduated college with a degree in engineering, Richard was there in the front row. The young man walked across the stage, confident and proud, and their eyes met for just a moment. Richard felt tears prick his eyes, but he didn't look away. He clapped until his palms stung. After the ceremony, Caleb found him outside, standing beneath the same kind of sky they had worked under years ago, wide, endless, and full of promise. You kept your word, Richard said. You built something that matters. Caleb smiled, shaking his head. We built it together. Richard laughed softly, his chest tight with joy. That we did. As the crowd drifted away, the two of them stood side by side, watching the sun dip low over the horizon. Neither spoke. There was no need. One act of kindness had changed 2 lives forever. And as the first stars began to appear, Richard realized that the boy he'd once met on a lonely highway had given him far more than help with a flat tire. He'd given him back his purpose. Because sometimes the smallest gestures don't just fix what's broken, they remind us what it means to be whole.